A ranger stood at the tree line. Not himself. Not quite. But wearing his clothes. A name tag. Faulkner. You weren't supposed to come this far, the man said. What is this place? A memory. A correction. A folder in someone's collection of national park stories. This isn't real. Real enough to be repeated. The ranger stepped forward, voice lower now. You read too much. Thought too hard. That's how these wilderness stories open. What happens if I leave? The ranger chuckled. Leave? You don't leave. You get passed along. Shared. Reposted. By who? People like you used to be. Curious. Lonely. Chasing ghosts and other people's scary stories. Then he handed Logan a matchbook. One match left. On the cover. Light to return, but not to yourself. He struck the match. The flame flickered, and then the world rewound. He woke up in his car. Daylight. No fog. No cemetery. No iron gate. Just the sound of birds. And his phone vibrating. A message. You're due for your shift. Caretaker, Logan Faulkner. Savage Hills Memorial Grounds, Gate C. He dropped the phone. Looked at his hands. Dirt under the nails. Boots muddy. His trunk was open. Inside, a shovel and a lantern. Meanwhile, online, a new thread appears on Reddit. Has anyone had the same cemetery dream more than once? There's this place with a rusted gate and a weird angel statue. I swear I saw myself digging a grave there. Same here, but mine said Savage too. This is like those creepy outdoors stories in park ranger threads. Anyone else dreaming this since last full moon? And far off in a forest where no map leads, another grave is being dug. The caretaker doesn't speak, doesn't sleep, but if you look close enough, he looks a little like someone you've read about before. Logan Faulkner didn't go home after waking up in the car. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post. He just drove, not to escape, but to confirm, because part of him still believed this was all a dream or a breakdown. That someone, somewhere, would remind him who he was, that he hadn't been assigned to that cemetery, that he hadn't dreamed it into being. He drove west, across Pennsylvania, into Ohio, through Indiana. Wherever he went, the signs showed up again. Savage, Echo Field, Red Rock Burial Hill, Dina's Stone, names from his journal, names he'd seen only in dreams, names he'd later find on threads from strangers and stories from Reddit. Posts tagged true creepy stories or let's not meet. Stories that started the same way. I had this dream. I found a trail that doesn't exist on maps. There was someone already in my tent. He wasn't alone. This was bigger. A pattern. Logan stopped at a ranger station in Missouri, up near the edge of Mark Twain National Forest. It was mostly empty. The clerk looked tired. Is there a Savage Park around here? Logan asked, pretending to check for a hiking route. The ranger's eyes narrowed. No state-recognized land by that name. But you've heard of it. The ranger said nothing, then handed Logan a photocopy. It was a scan of a missing person report, stapled over an incident log. Subject, Harold D. Brooks, Park Ranger. Last seen, March 12, 1999. Description, said he dreamed of a cemetery. Said it wanted him back. Report summary, subject abandoned post. Boots found near empty grave. Underlined at the bottom, in pen. Don't talk about Savage. Not here. Logan left before dusk. But the forest didn't let him go easily. The trees seemed to lean closer with every mile. The headlights flickered, then failed. And suddenly, there was no road at all. Just gravel. Just mist. And a crooked wooden sign nailed to an ancient oak. Caretaker's return. He slammed the brakes. But the car no longer moved. Behind him, the road was gone. Ahead was the cemetery. Only this time, it was different. Bigger. Older. Deeper. He stepped out into the cold. A foggy wind greeted him like breath from a forgotten mouth. And this time, there were others. Figures moving through the graveyard. Digging. Whispering. Some carried lanterns. Some had ranger uniforms, worn thin by time. One walked past him and Logan froze, because the man's name patch read, Brooks. Another figure had long black hair, a red backpack, and a Cornell University pin on the strap. Harper. They didn't see him, or they saw through him, as if he wasn't there yet. Logan stumbled through the rows, calling out, pleading, but everyone moved like players in a play without an audience. He came to a statue, the weeping angel again, but this time her hands were open, revealing a journal tucked in the stone fold. He pulled it free. First page. Caretakers don't die? They reset. Second page. We are the stories people forget they shared. Third page. If you're reading this, you're the last version. And beneath that, a name, Logan Faulkner, and a date, tomorrow. He looked up, and every headstone around him now had a name he recognized. Usernames from Reddit, handles from Twitter, names from podcasts that once covered creepy park ranger stories and national park stories you were never meant to hear. And every single one had an open grave in front of it, and a shovel next to it. Logan fell to his knees. He screamed. The mist did not echo. It absorbed. And from the edge of the cemetery, a group emerged. Not ghosts, not demons. Readers. They held phones, headphones in their ears, books in their hands, and they stared directly at him. One whispered, "We read you. You're ours now." Another, "He's viral. Tagged across true horror stories, creepy outdoor stories, and scary woods stories playlists." A third, in a soft voice, "Let's read him again." He turned. His other self, the first one, the digger, was waiting by the fresh grave. "I was the first post," he said, "but you're the one they saved." Logan tried to speak, but his mouth was full of dirt. He hadn't noticed, but he'd been digging the whole time, even while reading, even while screaming. His hands were raw. The grave was done, and inside it something stirred. He looked, and inside the grave was not a body. It was a screen, looping, flickering. Reddit threads, comments, YouTube thumbnails with titles like Top 5 True Scary Stories, Midnight Cemetery Edition, Creepiest National Park Disappearances No One Talks About, Real Stories That Starred in Dreams, Caretaker Who Buried Himself, True Horror Story. Then the screen faded, and reflected only him, staring back, alone. Somewhere, in a dorm room in Michigan, a student listens to a horror podcast before bed. The narrator mentions a name that feels too familiar. Logan Faulkner. He pauses the episode, because he dreamed of a cemetery last week, with a weeping angel, and he woke with dirt under his fingernails, and deep inside a graveyard that doesn't exist on any map, but appears in every terrifying subreddit. A man with no voice hands a shovel to the next arrival, and so it continues, until the readers stop reading, until the dreams stop being remembered, until someone says, "No more." But no one ever does, because there's always a next dreamer, a next caretaker, a next story. It had been 3 days since Logan Faulkner stopped being real. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't dream, because the dream had become him. He wandered the graveyard like a ghost without a death. The fog never lifted. The names on the tombstones changed daily. Usernames, podcast hosts, missing hikers, lost park rangers, some scratched in blood, some glowing faintly. He knew now this was not a cemetery. It was a library, a record, a holding pen for every true creepy story, scary story, or true horror story that people weren't supposed to remember, but did anyway. Sometimes he saw the others. They moved differently than him. Shadows, barely defined. Some were stuck in loops. Others whispered into holes in the dirt. One ranger just sat under a tree, repeating the same 5 words. I read it. I read it. Logan tried talking to him once. The ranger only stared and handed him a notepad. Inside was a list of story titles. Disappeared in dead fog. Don't enter the trail without a shadow. He dug the grave and found himself. The Reddit thread that writes you back. Each one had Logan's initials at the bottom. Some were stories from Reddit, others from dark forums, others scrawled by hand in unreadable penmanship. He flipped to the final page. It said, "When you become folklore, you don't choose your ending. The readers do." Logan wandered farther. He found places that shouldn't exist. A fire tower with no stairs. A trailhead where compasses spun in reverse. A ranger station with 20 radios, all repeating the same message in different languages. Story active. Memory unstable. Host, Logan Faulkner. In one room, he found maps of real national parks. Acadia, Yosemite, Yellowstone. But each one was marked with an X over a cemetery that didn't exist. Until people started dreaming about it. That night, a storm rolled in. Not weather, emotion. A psychic pressure that bent the trees sideways, made the graves glow, and pulled shadows upright. From the mist, a new figure emerged. Taller than Logan. Same build. But something was wrong. Its face was featureless. A blur. But it wore Logan's coat. His boots. His voice. "You're just a version," the thing said. A draft. A placeholder. Logan backed away. What do you want? I want to replace the reader, not the character. The figure pointed behind him, and Logan saw the screen again, the one in the grave. But this time, it showed a real person, a woman in her 30s, reading a thread on Reddit titled Caretaker Dreams. Anyone else? Logan's image flickered behind her reflection on the monitor. She's dreaming of me, he whispered. No, the figure said. You're dreaming of her. Logan felt his knees buckle. He understood. He wasn't alive anymore. He was a horror story being read over and over by people across the world. A loop powered by engagement, upvotes, downloads. He could feel it now. The podcast recitations, the late-night reposts, the TikTok stitches about scariest Reddit stories. Each one tightening the loop. Each one making him more real here, and less real anywhere else. The wind howled. The cemetery cracked. Tombstones shattered and reshaped into phone screens. A voice cried out from the fog. I remember this. This was on the Let's Not Meet series. Another laughed. It's just a story. Another whispered. I saw this in a dream before I ever read it. And somewhere, a bell rang. Logan reached the center of the graveyard again. The angel statue was gone, replaced by a mirror. He looked and saw every version of himself from every retelling. Logan the park ranger. Logan the hiker. Logan the student. Logan the unnamed narrator from creepy outdoor stories. Logan the podcast host who disappeared mid-episode. Logan the kid from a scary woods story that starts with, "So, I had this dream." They all looked back at him, and in unison, they asked, "Whose story are you now?" He dropped the journal, turned to run, but the cemetery had become a spiral, winding inward, each step leading closer to something ancient, something not written, but writing. In the center, a door, iron, rusted, etched with symbols from languages he didn't recognize. Above it, a line scratched in red. Exit for readers only. He reached for the handle, and it burned. Because he wasn't a reader. He was a sentence, a structure, a story. Behind him, dozens of others gathered. They all looked like people you'd swear you'd seen in a thread once, or heard in a midnight narration. One reached out. Her fingers melted into letters. Another opened his mouth, and a story title fell out. The Gravewarden, a true creepy story from the woods. The figure from earlier, the one with Logan's face, appeared beside him again. You don't get to leave. Logan shook. Then what do I get? You get shared. Somewhere in Oregon, a fire ranger hears a call come through on an unused channel. Grave complete. Upload ready. He dismisses it as a prank, until the name Logan Faulkner shows up in his call log, and a shovel appears outside his tower, with his name etched into the handle. Because now it's his story, just like it's soon going to be yours. Logan stood before the iron door. It no longer burned to the touch, but it didn't open either. He realized it wasn't locked. It was waiting for a choice. Because everything here was about choices. About attention. About being remembered. Behind him, the graveyard shimmered. Voices echoed through the mist. Stories told and retold. True horror stories whispered in forums. Creepy stories typed by candlelight. Scary true stories narrated by faceless voices at 3 a.m. Reddit threads where people begged, "Has anyone else seen this place?" The Gravewarden wasn't a person. It was a role, a placeholder, a sacrifice, a file saved in a folder called, "Do not open after midnight." Logan turned the handle, and the door opened to light. Not warmth, not heaven, awareness, a vast, electric hum, millions of minds all thinking, all reading, all listening at once. And at the center, a single thread, titled, "Help. I dreamt I was buried alive in a cemetery that doesn't exist." It had 400k upvotes, 6,127 comments, pinned, archived, saved by users with names like Nighthiker32, Dead Trail Runner, Old Forest Roof. Logan read the first comment. It simply said, "I dreamed it too." Then another. This was on the Creepy Park Ranger Stories playlist. Now this belongs on our /Let's Not Meet. Is this the guy from that Wilderness Story podcast? He's back? Bro, I swear I saw this name in another scary woods story from 2019. Logan closed his eyes and exhaled. He was no longer a man, no longer Logan. He was now a pattern, a puzzle, a keyword in someone's search bar, a recurring voice in a playlist titled, "True Creepy Stories That Keep You Up." And as the screen fades, the final sentence writes itself, not by a hand, but by collective memory. he still walks the graveyard. Just under the fog. Just out of frame. Then, darkness. But not the kind you wake up from. The kind you click away from. Until the next reader scrolls too far. Listens too long. Falls asleep with the episode still playing. And dreams of a man in boots. Digging. Just behind the angel statue. Under a sky with no stars. And if you're reading this, maybe you've already seen him. Maybe your fingers remember dirt. Maybe your dreams start looping. Just don't go looking. And if you do, don't speak your name near the gate. The roll is always waiting. And the grave is always open. When you dream of the same place over and over again, the last thing you expect is to wake up inside it. A man keeps having a recurring dream. He's working as a caretaker in a strange, fog-soaked cemetery that doesn't exist. Every dream ends the same. Him digging graves under a moonlit sky while someone, or something, watches from the tree line. One night, while driving alone through rural Oregon, he makes a wrong turn and ends up exactly where his dream always begins. The crooked gate, the moss-covered statues, the fog, and a man, bent over, digging a grave, who looks exactly like him. What you're about to read isn't fiction. It's part of a growing list of true horror stories circulating through online communities like Stories from Reddit and Let's Not Meet, shared by people who claim to have dreamed of the same graveyard before seeing it in real life. If you've ever had a looping nightmare, read with caution. Some say scary stories like this one don't just end. They wait. Logan Faulkner was 33 years old when the dream started. They weren't terrifying at first, just strange. In the first one, he stood alone in a dense wilderness, moonlight cutting faint lines across rows of crooked headstones. A rusted shovel rested in his gloved hand. Nearby, a lantern hissed with a dying flame. And always, there was a grave. Half-dug, the dirt cold, wet, and real under his nails. He never saw who he was digging for. He only ever saw himself, dressed like a caretaker from another era. Wool jacket, stained jeans, rubber boots. It felt wrong, and too specific. Like true creepy stories he used to read late at night on Reddit back in college. The second dream was longer. He remembered how the fog hugged his knees. How an owl stared too long without blinking. How distant bells chimed despite there being no church in sight. The worst part? He began recognizing details. Symbols on gravestones. A particular weeping angel statue with its fingers cracked. The iron gate at the edge of the woods, half-hinged and engraved with the word Savage, a name that meant nothing to him, until it started showing up on street signs when he drove to work. By the fifth dream, Logan had stopped sleeping well. He woke drenched in sweat, his heartbeat echoing like a shovel striking stone. His therapist blamed stress, but Logan didn't tell her everything. Like how he could smell the dirt on his hands when he woke, or how he once found his own footprints leading from his backyard to the woods, despite not remembering leaving the house. Everything shifted on a cold Thursday evening. Logan was driving home through upstate New York, trying to take a shortcut his GPS suggested. The roads narrowed. Fog crept up the sides of the windshield. The forest around him thickened. And then, the gate. That same iron gate from his dreams. It stood just off the road, barely visible through the mist. The word Savage rusted into the arch. He should have kept driving, but his hands turned the wheel anyway. The path wound through rows of dense trees, and the farther he went, the less his phone responded. No signal, no map, only memory. And by the time he reached the clearing, his mouth went dry. Because there it was, the cemetery from his dreams. Exactly the same. The same headstones, the same broken angel, the same half-dug grave. And next to it, himself, back turned, shovel in hand, sweat staining the back of his shirt. Logan slammed the brakes. But the figure didn't flinch, didn't turn, just kept digging. He stumbled out of the car, heart racing. "Itchy why," he shouted. The man stopped. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned. It was him. Same face, same haircut, same scar under the chin. Except, his eyes were sunken, skin pale, lips cracked, dirt in the creases of his neck. "What the hell is this?" Logan said, backing away. "You shouldn't have come," the other Logan whispered. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "I dreamed this," Logan said. "I didn't," the other replied. "I lived it." Logan ran, but every path he took led him back to the grave. The cemetery looped, over and over. Fog twisted the trees into shapes he didn't recognize. The ground grew soft, wet, like it was waiting to swallow something. Or someone. This wasn't a dream. This was one of those scary stories people post and delete an hour later. The kind with tags like, "Let's not meet," or "True horror stories from the woods." He had read those before. Now he was in one. When Logan finally made it back to his car, the keys were gone. But the passenger seat wasn't empty. Sitting there, as calm as stone, was a weathered leather book. No title. Inside, every page held journal entries. Names of people, dates, causes of death. He turned to the last entry. Logan Faulkner arrived. Replacement initiated. He flipped the page. Blank. Waiting. He looked up. His reflection in the rearview mirror smiled at him. But his mouth hadn't moved. From somewhere in the fog, a bell rang. The same sound from his dreams. He stepped outside and realized there were no birds, no insects, no wind, only stillness. And the grave, now finished, shovel waiting. He could either run again or finish the job. Somewhere in the real world, a post appeared. Ever dream of a cemetery that doesn't exist? With a broken angel statue? My uncle vanished after talking about it for weeks. Sounds like that post from our /creepy stories about the repeating graveyard. OP, don't go there. Read that horror story last year. Guy ended up replacing himself. Yo, I swear I had the same dream. This is giving wilderness stories vibes. Screenshotting this. Just in case. And deep in the fog, someone keeps digging. Because true scary stories don't end. They recycle. They reset. They wait for the next dreamer to turn the wheel. Logan didn't remember choosing to dig. But when he blinked, the shovel was already in his hand. His back ached. His hands were blistered. The soil yielded easily, like it had been waiting for him. Fog coiled around the nearby headstones, whispering in a voice too soft to be wind. The moon was wrong, too still, like a painted eye watching the entire outdoors story unfold. He wasn't dreaming. He had become the story. A voice broke the silence. You're almost done. He turned. It was himself, the other Logan, leaning against a tombstone with a lantern swinging at his side. This is how it starts, the other said. You dig. You forget. Then you stay. I'm not you, Logan snapped. The figure tilted his head, smiled. Neither was I. Logan dropped the shovel and backed away. I'm leaving. There's no exit here. Not without finishing what you started. Logan turned and ran, through the headstones, past the angel statue, toward the trees. But the woods bent, reformed, recycled themselves like a scary woods story with one setting and infinite versions. He burst into a clearing and found himself back at the grave, the dirt untouched, shovel waiting, like nothing had happened. He screamed. The grave didn't care. Neither did the night. This wasn't a place for the living. It was for the remembered, the once told, the half-dreamed, the characters from true creepy stories and true horror stories that people scroll past at 2 a.m., thinking, glad that's not me. But Logan was that story now, and the cemetery was reading him. At the edge of the clearing stood a ranger station, or what looked like one. Weathered logs, a broken radio tower, a flickering lamp inside. He didn't remember it from the dream. Maybe that was good. Maybe it was new. He rushed toward it, heart pounding. Inside, everything was dusted and gray. Boots by the door, old maps on the walls, and a table covered in manila folders. He flipped them open. Reports from across the country, each titled the same. Temporal Cemetery Incursions, Archive, GRW Section. Appalachian National Forest, Ranger reported seeing himself digging. Oregon, hiker found unconscious by headstone dated 20 years in the future. Alaska, missing person reappeared with no memory, hands covered in fresh soil. Echo Field Park, unlisted graveyard appeared, then vanished. He picked up a final file. His name was on the cover. Logan Faulkner. Recurring dream subject. Status. Merged. There was a photo, black and white, of him, but older, colder, eyes blank. A ranger hat rested on the desk. Logan stared at it. Voices crackled from the broken radio. You reading this? Stories from Reddit, tagged, let's not meet. Loop initiated, repeat, repeat. He backed out of the station, and the forest had changed again. This time, dozens of graves surrounded him. Each had a name etched in red stone. Some he recognized, from creepy park ranger stories, from urban legends, from old threads where people claim to see themselves die in dreams before disappearing. Jonah Stalls, March 1998. Dino Wexler, October 2002. Logan Faulkner. The final grave was blank. Waiting. Someone was behind him. He turned.